Hello and welcome to OBN Horn of Africa. This is our weekly program, Future Africa, and I'm Fantambelete hosting this program. Today, I'm joined by Girma Gadisa, human rights and criminal justice expert. In this episode, we are going to discuss transitional justice in Ethiopia, that Ethiopia is exercising right now. Girma Gadisa, thank you for joining me and welcome to this program.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you for having me.
Great. Before we directly go to the discussion, would you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you, Anton. I am a lawyer by training. My expertise in human rights. My research areas are around issues of transitional justice and human rights in general. I had a little bit of background in teaching. I used to teach at Haramain University years ago, but now I am in the practice world, working with national institutions as well as regional, Pan-African, and international organizations on various aspects of human rights.
Ethiopia is working to conduct transitional justice. Would you provide us the overview of Ethiopia's historical context that urged or that led the need for undergoing transitional justice, please?
Thank you, Fontaine. Just let me begin with what we mean by transitional justice and why it is needed in the context of our country. So transitional justice is basically it's a mechanism that state or society that have been in injustice or gross human rights violations or repression regimes used to transit to democratic and peaceful political system. So broadly speaking, it's like a bridge between past divisions, past injustice, historical injustice to a better future where society live in peace in a very reconciled way. So it involves basically judicial as well as non-judicial measures. So that it is against this background that we should see how Ethiopia ended up designing and implementing transitional justice in its political system. As you know, Ethiopia is a country with a history of gross human rights violation, be it under the autocratic rule or under the military dictatorship or the past repressive regimes. We all know that despite their differences in ideologies and the nature of the governance, there are things that are very common across all these regimes. That is actually economic, political, and cultural marginalization of different society. And there was gross human rights violations ranging from actually summary execution, displacement, forced disappearance, economic marginalizations, and conflicts that have been happening here and there over a long period of time, actually having a very devastating impact on the country's political as well as socioeconomic landscape. So, despite the prevalence of that human rights violation, gross human rights violations, comprehensive measures were not taken to address these issues. There were public grievances and dissatisfaction that have been accumulated over the years. Even the recently adopted federal state structure has been mismanaged in different ways. So there is actually an unaddressed historical injustice in the past, divisions among various ethnic groups and ethnic tensions. And at the same time, also, there is a public demand, quest for justice. There are also antagonistic historical narrations that have been fueling actually conflict across ethnic groups, across regional states, including on border issues. So it is actually the accumulation and the aggregation of all these factors that actually necessitated the need for transitional justice. So at some point, we cannot continue fighting, cannot continue in history of injustice. We cannot continue marginalizing societies. So at that point, I think the government took the initiative of coming up with a transitional justice idea, both internally from the government and also externally by quest from the society, from national actors and all that. So it is actually the aggregation of our past and also the need for us to move forward to a very consolidated democracy, peaceful nation. That is actually the historical background that led us where we are today.
What are the key events or causal factors in Ethiopia's history that have significantly impacted the current transitional justice efforts?
Well, Fantone, I would say many factors have contributed to the decision to design and implement transitional justice in Ethiopia. Um, I would, in general, put the gross human rights violations that have happened in the past, and also the recurrent and the prolonged conflict are the major issues that actually pushed all the actors to move toward transitional justice process. But if we have to pick few important historical junctures that are critical, or we can call them key events in moving the country to the transitional justice process, I think we can start from the recent public protest that started in 2015. Of course, there are historical events before that, but just to have a time frame closer to where we are now, in 2014, 2015, protests that started in the Oromia region actually spread over the country throughout the regions, especially in the Amara regions and all that, led the country, the government, to actually undergo a reform. So one of the key events, I would say, is the nationwide protest, uh, where the public were out on the streets asking and demanding for justice and reform within the government structures. That reform actually led to the coming to power of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in 2018. And I would also add the acknowledgement of state violence by the Prime Minister in his inaugural statement, where he acknowledged that there was state violence. Violence was committed against citizens by the government. I would take that as a very critical juncture or event that led to the current transitional justice scenario. It created a conducive political environment. So the reform after 2018 created an environment where diverge political ideologies were in the market, in the political market. So that's another historical event that led to the current process. Another critical event was, I would say, is the Pretoria Peace Agreement that was signed between Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the federal government, ending the deadly 2 years conflict. That's also another critical event in history, especially in moving the country towards fast tracking of transitional justice mechanisms. It is very important to note that the Pretoria Peace Agreement by itself is not the event which triggered the transitional justice. There is a misconception among many people that transitional justice started after the Pretoria Peace Agreement. No, transitional justice processes were already in place since 2018, but Pretoria Agreement is one of the key events in moving the country toward transitional justice policy and then follow-up activities. Of course, there are pressures from the international community. It has been there, including the agencies of United Nations. They have been pushing for the implementation of transitional justice. So all these actually are events that cumulatively pushed the country to have a transitional justice policy in place.
How do you see the specific steps Ethiopia has taken to exercise this transitional justice?
Well, Fantaon, I would say a lot of steps have been taken. to come up with the transitional justice policy. I would say the major milestone in the Ethiopia's effort to implement transitional justice measures is the adoption of transitional justice policy. That's very critical, I think. It also indicates the country's commitment, actually, to have transitional justice at a policy level. That has never been um, seen in other countries. So having transitional justice policy is a critical step in the transitional justice of Ethiopia, I would say. Just to take you back a little bit, the transitional justice policy was informed by nationwide consultations. So the consultations were actually led by transitional justice working groups, transitional justice working group of experts that was established by the Ministry of Justice, but an independent groups of experts. They actually led the process of collecting public opinions and ideas around how to frame the transitional justice, what mechanisms. So they conducted more than 80 consultations. Also, institutions like Ethiopian Human Rights Commission have been holding consultations and publishing critical reports that have actually impacted the crafting of the transitional justice policy. So the adoption of the transitional justice policy should be taken as a critical step in ensuring the implementation of transitional justice mechanisms in the country. So in the transitional justice policy, already a wide range of transitional justice mechanisms such as prosecution, truth-seeking, amnesty, reparation, institutional reforms, all these comprehensive elements are already included in the policy. So next to the adoption of the policy, I would say the development of transitional justice implementation roadmap that was actually adopted just a month ago or so, in August 2024, if I'm not mistaken. That's also another critical step because it indicates each and every step that is needed to actually translate the transitional justice policy into action. So after the adoption of, or after the development of the transitional justice implementation roadmap, the Ministry of Justice is now actually undergoing drafting legislations that would give life to the transitional justice policy. So these are some of the milestones, the steps that are taken here and there. But they have got their own commendable aspects where we should actually appreciate the efforts taken by the government. And also there are also drawbacks, including the fact that some of the opposition political parties were not actually involved in the transitional justice policy development to the extent that they should. Some of them, they have walked out of consultations. Some of them, they have boycotted. Those could be taken as drawbacks that should be rectified going forward. But the steps that are taken so far are commendable, especially in coming up with the transitional justice policy.
Thank you very much. How do transitional justice and national dialogue relate or differ?
I would say one of the goals of transitional justice is actually to ensure reconciliation among members of the society that are divided along be it ethnic line, religion line, or political ideologies. So the national dialogue is one tool to implement transitional justice, I would say. So they are interdependent and interrelated. So to realize reconciliation, you have to bring together different parties so that they resolve their differences through dialogue. When that kind of dialogue happens at the national level, when it is a nationwide, we call it national dialogue. So the national dialogue process actually, it can be considered as a tool or a component of transitional justice that is used to achieve one goal of transitional justice, which is reconciliation. So within the broader framework of transitional justice, which are more than reconciliation, we can see where national dialogue fits. It actually helps us to reconcile the societies that have sharp divisions along ethnic line, religion, or political ideologies. So at the heart of transitional justice is reconciliation. The same is true for national dialogue. So these are very interdependent processes, but transitional justice is a broader framework. It is an umbrella term that also encompasses national dialogue processes.
Thank you very much. What role do local communities, religious institutions, and political actors play in the transitional justice process in Ethiopia?
That's very critical question. Already in the transitional justice policy, there are sections that deal with how to include transitional dispute resolution mechanisms in the transitional justice. Definitely, this is very critical, given that our society very much depend on dispute resolution mechanisms. So if you, for example, take the Oromo community, Jarsuma is actually very integral part of the society. That's how the society resolves its dispute. Parallel mechanisms are there in other parts of the country, be it Shimgilina in the northern part of the country, and other traditional mechanisms across the country. These traditional mechanisms have actually proved to play a very key role in ensuring transitional justice. I think we can take the example of Gacaca Court in Rwanda in the post-genocide period, where those courts were used to deal with actually minor issues in the society. And the traditional dispute resolution mechanisms, they actually have a reconciliatory element. They focus more on reconciling the society, on bringing the society together. It is not like a criminal justice system where you put somebody, convict the criminals, and then put them behind the bars. No. In the traditional justice system, more of reconciliation. In addition to that, I think the religious institutions also play a very critical role. The reason why I say that is if you take reconciliation, one of the transitional justice pillar, it actually has got the element of forgiveness. So for people to reconcile, they have to forgive each other. And religious institutions, as you know, they are based on the concept of forgiveness. I would just like to draw you attention to the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The head, the chairperson of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Bishop Desmond Tutu. Actually, he said the only way to experience healing and the peace is to forgive. So if we do not forgive, there is no way that we experience personal peace and also societal peace. So religious institutions play a very crucial role in actually fostering forgiveness and accepting differences and live together in a peaceful way. Again, I would add media to this. I think media plays a very critical role again in public sensitization, raising awareness on transitional justice mechanisms, why we need it, why the society should participate in the processes in a very active way. So the role of local communities, community leaders, religious institutions, political actors, and media is very, very important in realizing the effective implementation of transitional justice mechanisms. Because these groups of people, these institutions are actually, they are involved in the day-to-day life of the members of the society that we are trying to reconcile and bring together.
Thank you again. What challenges do you expect in implementing this transitional justice in Ethiopia?
Well, Fantao, I would say there are a couple of challenges that are still ongoing in terms of implementing the transition justice. Uh, the first one, I would say, the political instability and ongoing conflict that is happening almost in two or three regions across the country. There are armed groups operating in different parts of Oromia and Amhara region. So the ongoing conflict definitely have its own impact on transitional justice processes. The reason is one, you don't even have the logistics and the logistics arrangement for uh, personnel who are implementing the transitional justice process move from one part of the country to the part when there is insecurity, instability, and a conflict. So usually there is a bare minimum requirement of peace and stability to implement transitional justice. But in the absence of that, definitely it will be very difficult to properly and effectively implement transitional justice. Again, this is also related to the non-participation of some political parties. As I mentioned earlier, some of the political parties have already boycotted the process, which actually raises questions around the legitimacy and the credibility and the national ownership of the transitional justice process. So while the political parties are not involved in the process, and when at the same time there is a instability and insecurity in some parts of the country, it would be challenging to implement the process of transitional justice. I would also say that at this point in time, we have not yet started the implementing the transitional justice in its real sense, because these are the policy level, the laws that allow the policy to have come to effect should have been should be implemented for us to go fully into the transitional justice process. But once we go into the transitional justice process, I would say the implementation part, I mean, it is a very resource intensive process. So the country is just coming out. The impact of the conflict is very visible in the daily life of the people, so also in the economy of the country. So resource constraint would also be one of the challenges in implementing nationwide effective transitional justice process. I would also add issues related to public participation. If you remember, in the past, Ethiopia has tried to establish commissions that work toward this reconciliation, the National Reconciliation Commission. You can also raise administrative boundaries and identity commission that were established in 2018.
How are victims of past atrocities being engaged in the transitional justice process?
Well, I would say the transitional justice policy actually made it clear that all the processes should be victim-centered. So it clearly stipulates that the transitional justice mechanisms should be victim-centered, whether it is criminal accountability, truth commission, or amnesty, whether it is reparation or institutional reform. It is very clear. Victim-centeredness is at the pillar of the transitional justice. The challenge comes on how to implement, when we implement, and how to actually translate this to practice. So as far as the policy is concerned, for example, there are provisions in the policy which says victims should actually participate in the criminal proceedings. This could be as a witness, for example. Of course, they need to be, there is a need to have safeguarding measures or psychosocial support for victims that are involved in the criminal justice process so that they are not traumatized by the memories of human rights violations that they suffered from in the past. For example, in the truth-seeking process, victims will speak out what happened to them, what happened to their loved ones, who did what to them. So there will be a platform for truth-seeking process where victims are given the opportunity to engage in the transitional justice process. Again, if we take rehabilitation, definitely that's also something that involves active participation of victims. For example, if you take the victims of sexual violation across the conflict affected areas, um, those victims should be actually provided with rehabilitation service. They should be provided with health services so that they recover from the damage that they suffered during the conflict. So even the reparation processes, whether it is individual reparation or collective reparation as a society, there is victims' participation aspect to it. So generally speaking, transitional justice policy puts very high emphasis on victims' participation in a sense that it emphasizes on victim-centeredness of the whole process. Whether that is going to be implemented is something that we are going to see in the next phase of the transitional justice implementation process.
What measures are in place to ensure accountability for perpetrators of human rights violation?
Accountability is actually one of the major pillars of the transitional justice processes. This is actually very clear even from the African Union justice policy, from which Ethiopia borrowed a lot of elements. So, in the absence of accountability for violations of human rights, it would be very difficult even to imagine the implementation of justice. But when we see accountability, we need to see it in a very broad term. It's not only the criminal accountability. It's not only the prosecution of people who commit crimes. It's not only putting people in jail. It goes beyond that. So, yes, definitely for gross human rights violations, especially like war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, extrajudicial killing, um, people who are most responsible for those kind of crimes are actually envisaged to be prosecuted under the transitional justice mechanisms. But definitely the accountability framework goes beyond criminal accountability. For example, institutional reform is another way of ensuring accountability. What does that mean? For example, institutional accountability or institutional reform, which is also called vetting in other parts of the continent, is removing from office actually people who enabled the violations occur. So especially in sectors, critical sectors like the military, police service, all that. People who actually played critical role in actually enabling the violations of rights should also be removed from their office. So that's also another way of ensuring accountability. But broadly speaking, criminal justice, criminal accountability is at the center of transitional justice mechanisms, as indicated in the transitional justice policy. And the policy actually stipulates that special prosecution office should be established, and also a special chamber should be established within the existing court system to try cases involving gross human rights violations. So it should be seen holistically. For example, if you take even reparation is one way of ensuring accountability. People who have looted public property should account. People who have actually benefited in undue way from what happened in the past should account for that. So people who have grabbed lands in a very legal way should be held accountable. So those are actually some of the accountability frameworks that can be implemented to hold perpetrators account, but it should be seen in a very holistic way, not a very narrow and criminal justice focused. Should go beyond criminal justice and then look into other non-judicial forms of transitional justice.
How do you assess the effectiveness of transitional justice efforts in fostering reconciliation in Ethiopia?
Well, Fanton, so that depends on actually on what extent we effectively implement the whole transitional justice processes. So as I mentioned earlier, reconciliation is one aspect of transitional justice. It is one of the goals of transitional justice. It can only be achieved when we also implement other transitional justice mechanisms, yes, reparation, criminal accountability, truth finding, and all that in a very comprehensive way. So reconciliation alone cannot be picked and assessed in its own term. I think we need to have that holistic approach and a comprehensive view of the whole transitional justice process, contributing to reconciling the society that have got sharp divisions. So definitely the establishment of truth-seeking commission plays a critical role in this regard, bringing truth out, because where there is no truth, actually, it's very difficult to reconcile communities. So bringing out truth, showing what happened in the past would help in terms of reconciling. It is not like a criminal justice system where you put somebody, convict the criminals and then put them behind the bars. No, in the traditional justice system, more of reconciliation. In addition to that, I think the religious institutions also play a very critical role. The reason why I say that is if you take reconciliation, one of the traditional justice pillar, it actually has got the element of forgiveness. So for people to reconcile, they have to forgive each other. And religious institutions, as you know, they are based on the concept of forgiveness. I would say the political willingness from the government and also from the other political parties sit together and to try to reconcile their constituencies is very critical. I would say the elites in different political groups should play a very critical role in actually mobilizing their supporters come to terms of reconciliation. Because unless we reconcile, we cannot continue along the lines of divisions. So yes, reconciliation is important, but the success of reconciliation also depends on the success of other traditional justice. It cannot stand in isolation by itself.
What role do international organizations and NGOs play in supporting Ethiopia's transitional justice initiative?
Thank you, Van Down. I think this is a very critical question. The transitional justice policy is very clear on what role the international organizations play. For example, in the special chamber that's going to be established within the existing court system, it indicates that experts, transitional justice experts, can play advisory role. International transitional justice experts can play advisory role in the process of supporting effective implementation of transitional justice. But when it comes to NGOs, I would say they can play one a supportive role in terms of providing technical as well as financial assistance. I've already indicated that transitional justice is a very resource intensive undertaking. It's very expensive. So financial assistance from the development partners is very critical. Also technical assistance. There are NGOs in the continent, in Africa and beyond, that have been working on transitional justice for years. So we should actually benefit from their technical support in implementing transitional justice in Ethiopia. So they can actually train people who are involved in the implementation processes. They can also actually support the local civil society organizations so that they engage actively in the processes, be it in mobilizing communities, in training communities, in raising awareness, in engaging actually with every aspect of transitional justice, including by playing a watchdog role to see whether actually the transitional justice process is being implemented in the way it was envisaged in the transitional justice policy. So the international actors can really support the whole process through technical, financial assistance, and lending their expertise to the local actors.
How do you see Ethiopia's approach to transitional justice practice compared to other countries that have undergone similar processes?
There are countries that have actually undergone transitional justice processes, even within the context of our continent, Africa. You can take the example of South Africa, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, recently the Gambia. There are countries here and there that have implemented transitional justice mechanisms. I would say the Ethiopia's process has got similarities and also differences. Of course, the similarities would be there are past gross human rights violations in all these countries that have undergone transitional justice processes. The same is true in Ethiopia. The countries also, or the bigger goal of these countries implementing transitional justice is actually to move to reconciliation, peace, to democracy, more egalitarian society. So the same is true in Ethiopia. Ethiopia's approach is a little bit different in a way that the transitional justice policy that is in place now is a very comprehensive policy, I would say. It is inclusive of all mechanisms, at least at the policy level. The implementation, we are yet to see. At the policy level, the major transitional justice mechanisms are already included in the transitional justice, ranging from criminal accountability, truth and reconciliation, amnesty, institutional reform, reparations. That is actually a very comprehensive policy. Again, Ethiopia is different in the sense that there was a nationwide consultation that led to the process. That actually puts Ethiopia in a very different scenario from other countries because not other countries got that opportunity of undertaking nationwide consultation. At the same time, I would say the fact that Ethiopia is a country with multicultural society somehow makes it different from other countries. If you take South Africa, of course, there is diversity, but it's not as diverse as Ethiopia. If you take Rwanda, the same is true. So the diversities, ethnic diversities, cultural diversities across the country makes it a little bit different from the transitional justice policy.
What are the potential long-term impacts of transitional justice on Ethiopia's political landscape?
Thank you, Van Down. It has got a lot of long-term impact if we have let me repeat that. If we are able to implement the transitional justice in a very inclusive way, in a very effective way, I would say it has got potential of actually changing the political landscape. Why I say so? So the successful implementation of the process actually creates a political culture where political differences are not uh, resolved through guns, but resolved through peaceful dispute resolution mechanisms. So, as you know, we have been well known for having prolonged conflicts, recurrent conflicts. So political differences in the past were used to be resolved through conflict, through guns. So changing that narration and instilling the culture of resolving disputes through peaceful mechanisms, I would say that is the biggest gain if we are able to implement the transitional justice process successfully. Again, it also fosters the culture of dialogue. The political landscape of Ethiopia is not very familiar with dialogue processes. So if the dialogue process goes well, if the truth-finding process goes well, as is already stated in the transitional justice policy, the political landscape of the country will have that culture of dialogue. Again, I would say another critical impact would be it sends a strong signal that human rights violations are not tolerated in this country. So it would really have a great impact if we have successful implementation processes.
Girma Gadisa, human rights and criminal justice expert, thank you for your time and precious analysis.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fantawa.
You're welcome. Well, this brings us to the end. Thank you for watching and stay connected with other programs of OBN Horn of Africa.